Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen. Chapter 35. Dan Kelly stepped into the cold, sterile environment of the Los Angeles County morgue. The harsh fluorescent lighting reflecting off the pale green walls cast an unnatural pallor over everything, making even the living look corpse-like. The air held a sharp chemical scent. As Dan and Mike walked into the autopsy room, their eyes were drawn to the rows of body lockers lining the walls. In this quiet space, their footsteps were enough to interrupt Detective Thacker and Dr. Simon French. The medical examiner was a tall, lanky man with thinning gray hair and thick-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He was a serious man, but not unfriendly. As they were introduced, Dan noticed the doctor's hands. They were long-fingered and strong. The doctor gestured for them to gather around two examination tables, where the bodies of Nancy Sanchez and Cindy Finch lay. Dr. French pulled back the sheets, revealing the victim's gray, waxy skin. In death, they looked nothing like the vibrant women they had once been. Instead, they appeared small and fragile, their features slack and lifeless. The bodies seemed more like anatomical specimens than people now, stripped of the personalities that had animated them until they met their killer. As the medical examiner began his explanation, Dan found his eyes drawn to the Y incisions on the victims' torsos, a reminder of the autopsies they had undergone. He listened to Dr. French's clinical description of their injuries and cause of death, and tried to focus on the facts rather than the humanity that had been lost. As Dr. French referred to his notes, his simple, straightforward tone seemed at odds with the serious subject matter. The medical examiner confirmed what they had suspected. Nancy Sanchez, like the other victims, had been drugged.
As with the first two victims, Amy Carson and Susie Duke, Nancy Sanchez ingested a large quantity of chlorohydrate, which should have incapacitated her.
Mike cut through the antiseptic air of the morgue.
Slipped a Mickey?
Dr. French accepted Mike's use of the colloquialism.
Good enough description, Captain. The contents of their stomachs suggest the chlorohydrate was in champagne.
Detective Thacker frowned.
There were no champagne bottles found at any of the crime scenes.
Yeah. The killer took them.
Mike said. It was more of a statement than a question. You did not include Cindy Finch?
No, there was no chlorohydrate or champagne in her stomach.
In response to the looks his answer drew, he went on.
The chlorohydrate was used to immobilize the other three. Cindy Finch was a heroin addict.
Mike piped in.
Who could have been loaded and did not have to be drugged.
The doctor nodded.
That seems likely.
Dr. French cleared his throat and resumed.
But chlorohydrate and champagne were in Nancy Sanchez's system. It would have worked too if the killer had waited 15 minutes. But, and I'm guessing here, the killer just did not wait long enough. They struggled, and a single stab to the chest pierced her heart and killed her.
She was stabbed because the killer was impatient?
Dr. French agreed. He went on to explain that the other three women were killed with injections of sodium pentobarbital.
It's typically used to put down horses. It's not difficult to get. In the quantities used, death would have been quick.
When Thacker inquired about the mutilation, Dr. French confirmed it was likely the same assailant, noting the rougher incisions on Sanchez compared to the first three victims. He believed the same knife was used. Dan Kelly asked, "Do we have any idea of where the missing organs are?" He looked at Thacker, who had nothing to offer.
No, not with Sanchez or the previous three.
This answer surprised no one. Dr. French just shrugged. Do you think the killer had medical training? Possibly a doctor.
No surgeon would do this.
It was clear that Dr. French took exception to even the suggestion that a doctor, one of his own, one who had sworn to do no harm, could have done this. It was the first hint of emotion the doctor had shown, and it brought a small smile to Dan's face.
Is it possible that someone with medical training did these removals roughly to hide the fact that they have training?
Mike asked, his voice echoing in the sterile room. Dr. French paused, pondering the idea. Dan picked up on a slight twitch in the doctor's nimble hands as he thought.
Sure, I suppose that is possible. But I don't know what that gets you, you know. The difference between an incompetent and someone pretending to be incompetent.
What does it mean that our murderer wants to kill these women without causing pain, and then treats their bodies so savagely? What does that mean? The question went unanswered for a moment. Dr. French was the first to respond, his factual demeanor breaking for the moment.
It could suggest a conflicted individual.
The medical examiner offered.
Someone who can't bring themselves to cause pain in the moment of death, but feels compelled to mutilate afterward.
Or maybe it's about control. Killing them quickly means they can't fight back, can't mess up whatever sick plan the killer has.
Detective Thacker rested against one of the examination tables, his face one of contemplation.
Remorse? Our killer might be struggling with his actions, trying to make the actual death as painless as possible.
Dan posed another hard question. But why take the organs? What purpose does that serve? He asked, more to himself than the others. The group fell silent, and the hum of the morgue's refrigeration units seemed to grow louder in the absence of conversation. Finally, Dr. French sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose.
The truth is, gentlemen, we don't know what it means. We can speculate, but without more information, we're just guessing.
So besides the stabbing, is there anything different about this murder? Nancy Sanchez?
Dr. French shook his head.
Other than what I've said, no.
He then gestured toward the body of Cindy Finch, his bony fingers pointing with precision.
This one had gonorrhea.
This one,
Thacker said, cutting him off mid-sentence. A glimmer of satisfaction materialized in Dr. French's eyes as he recited details of the previous victims' autopsies.
The first one had genital warts and syphilis. The second one had syphilis.
The two detectives and the army captain displayed blank expressions. The doctor smiled, then added with a gentle chide,
It was in the reports.
Dr. French continued.
And Nancy Sanchez had syphilis.
all four had VD.
Thacker asked, undeniably surprised. Dan also found this odd. But before he could say anything, Dr. French addressed the issue.
While the chances of finding 4 prostitutes all with venereal diseases at the same time are high, it's practically a certainty that any prostitute will contract these diseases at some point. Often, they'll have multiple infections simultaneously, and they'll get reinfected several times throughout their lives. It's simply the harsh reality of what they do. Gonorrhea, for example, often goes undiagnosed in women.
He explained.
Fortunately, we now have penicillin. It will clean up most of these horrors, only a few of the many blights it saves us from. 10 years ago, it was a different story. And the thing is, just a little precaution and common sense could stop these diseases from spreading.
Mike spoke up.
There was a prescription for penicillin in her, Sanchez's medicine cabinet.
That would be why.
Dr. French replied simply and smiled. Seeing no further questions, Dr. French began to wrap up the discussion. He turned to Thacker.
I can have my written report to you tomorrow?
Fine. Thanks, Simon.
In the hallway, Thacker took his leave and hurried off. As Dan and Mike prepared to follow, they heard footsteps behind them. Turning, they saw Dr. French approaching, his lab coat swishing with each step.
You were in Rome after the war?
Dr. French asked, his tone curious.
We were.
Dr. French took on a distant look.
I was in Berlin in 45 and 46. That was a trial by fire. They had nothing.
Dan agreed, reflecting on his own experiences in post-war Rome. It was similar in Italy, he said while giving the doctor an affirmative smile.
The city was in ruins. Bombed out buildings as far as the eye could see. Food was scarce. And what little there was, well, let's just say you didn't ask where it came from.
Mike grimaced, recalling similar scenes.
We saw that in Rome, too. People doing whatever they could to survive.
The faces of the survivors.
Dr. French said, shaking his head.
I'll never forget those looks. Haunted. Desperate.
Dan remembered Rome, the hollow-eyed children begging on the streets. Dr. French offered.
We did what we could, of course. But the needs were so great and our resources so limited. One day, we got a shipment of penicillin. The way people reacted, you'd have thought it was gold.
I can imagine. We had similar problems with medical supplies in Rome. It was like watching miracles happen.
Yes, exactly. In the midst of all that darkness, those small victories, they kept us going.
While Rome had suffered some bombing during the war, the number of Allied air raids had been limited, and the damage was relatively minor compared to the near-total devastation of Berlin. Dan could only imagine the scale of destruction Dr. French had witnessed in the German capital, far beyond anything he'd seen in Rome. Mike tilted his head.
Were you with the army?
Dr. French shook his head.
No. The AMA put out a call right after the war. Seemed like the thing to do. I'd been unable to serve.
He was happy to be able to talk about his time in Berlin with two others who had been through the same.
A relief group out of Chicago footed the bill for the clinic I was in.
Dan noticed a change in Dr. French. The objective detachment from earlier had melted away, replaced by a warmth, born of shared experience. As they shook hands, an understanding passed between Dan, Mike, and the doctor, like veterans recognizing old comrades. Chapter 36. The LAPD homicide squad room was quiet, save for the valiant efforts of a large fan struggling to cool the city's finest. Tired, Dan and Mike trudged toward Thacker's office door, where they saw on his desk, as promised, a stack of personnel files from the Air Force. Thacker was out, but Detective Rice was there. He greeted them with a warm smile and offered to update them over coffee. The caffeine offer sounded just about right to clear their foggy minds. Rice spoke informally as he began to brief them on the latest developments. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a uniformed officer. He burst in with an air of excitement, his eyes dancing.
One of you named Rice?
When Rice nodded, the patrolman continued.
I'm Nick Carey.
Impatient, Nick Carey's eyes sparkled with mischief as he launched into his tale, gesticulating wildly.
Last night, I'm chatting with old Mr. Rieger about his busted drugstore window when it becomes like a scene straight out of the Keystone Cops.
Dan pictured the mayhem and confusion of those silent comedy chases. Dan, Mike, and Rice leaned in, their fatigue momentarily forgotten as Carey's enthusiasm proved contagious.
This whore comes tearing down Harbor Parkway like her life depends on it, screaming her head off. And get this, she's barefoot. But that's not even the craziest part. Her stomach was dripping blood red.
The three detectives traded looks. The mention of blood had got their attention.
And she's not out for a leisurely run. Oh no. She's in hot pursuit of some poor bastard running like the devil is on his tail. Meanwhile, this Chevy comes screeching around the corner, comes face to face with our bloody runner, and decides the sidewalk looks like a better option. Tires squealing, pedestrians diving for cover. It was wild.
Carrie paused for dramatic effect, clearly relishing his captive audience.
So there I am, blowing my whistle, trying to restore some semblance of order. And just then, this mangy mutt decides to join the party, starts chasing after our bloody barefoot banshee like he's after a rabbit. I'm telling you, it was like something out of a Charlie Chaplin movie. All we needed was some pie throwing.
Dan, Mike, and Rice waited for him to get to the end. What had started as a funny story had become a potential lead in their investigation. The bloody woman running down Harbor Parkway was something they needed to look into further. However, Carrie immediately dispelled their concerns, chuckling.
It was just red ink.
The three of them had gotten very interested in Carrie's account when it was about blood. Now, they didn't know what to think. Carrie went on to say they had arrested the man, identifying him as William Young, known to the local girls as Bible Bill.
Seems for some time he's been accosting whores, streetwalkers all over LA. He is on a holy mission.
Carrie grinned to himself about what was coming.
He's gonna save their souls, save them from damnation. He quotes the Bible and wants them to pray. That's where Bible Bill comes from. The women have just ignored him until now.
Carrie's delivery remained light-hearted as he twirled his finger near his right ear, suggesting that William Young's mental state was up for debate.
Yep, nutty as a fruitcake. We're trying to decide what to do with him. Yeah, anyway, he apparently approached 3 hookers, and when they wouldn't listen, he threw red ink all over one of them. She was fit to be tied. It took a while for the woman, Alice Guthrie, to calm down enough so I could get her story out of her.
The young officer was having too much fun retelling it. With a glint in his eye, Carrie asked,
I'll bet you're wondering why I'm telling you this.
Indeed, they were. The seemingly unconnected nature of the mayhem from the night before had caught their interest. But why was he telling them about it?
Seems William Young was in Rome in 1946.
Before Patrolman Carey had time to finish his sentence, Dan and Mike were moving. William Young sat in an interview room, hunched in his chair. His meek appearance, disheveled clothing, and bent wire-rimmed glasses made him look vulnerable, completely at odds with the evil he was suspected of. To Dan and Mike, he looked harmless, almost fragile, with a bewildered look on his long face. Young's yellowed fingernails skittered across his Bible's cracked leather cover, circling and retracing the same path. As they entered the interview room, Young's eyes lit up, eager to share his story.
I'm doing God's work.
His declaration was full of passion. Dan and Mike looked at each other, acknowledging the delicate nature of the situation.
Mr. Young, I'm Detective Dan Kelly.
Then Dan gestured to Mike.
And this is Captain Mike Fiorante. We are very interested in what you have to say.
Young launched into an explanation of his mission, his words pouring forth with religious fervor. He spoke of salvation, of saving souls from the depths of sin and depravity. The red ink was a symbol of the blood of Christ, meant to shock the women into realizing the error of their ways. As Young continued his impassioned speech, Dan flipped through the notes Carrie had provided. His eyes landed on the dates Young had been in Rome, but he decided to let the man talk.
Now, what can you tell us about yourself?
The question seemed to transport Young to another time and place. His eyes took on a distant, unfocused look as he began to recount his own history.
I was born and raised in Tempe. That's in Arizona, near Phoenix.
His voice took on a nostalgic quality.
Got the call to do God's work early on when I was just a boy. Felt it deep in my bones, you know?
He adjusted his glasses.
Went to divinity school and was ordained in Atlanta in the Presbyterian Church, ready to serve. That was just before Pearl Harbor changed everything.
Young went on to describe his 4 years at a church in Georgia. Then, he continued to his post-war mission in Rome.
The church sent us. Things were bad in Rome.
He shook his head in both sadness and reverence.
Everywhere you looked, there was need. Hungry children in the streets, families torn apart. The work was good and necessary, bringing hope to those who had lost everything.
He trailed off, seemingly adrift in memory, when he spoke of discovering the fallen women selling themselves in the street. His mood shifted. His eyes blazed as he talked about God giving him a mission.
My Italian wasn't great, but I pushed through. I brought them the word of Jesus Christ.
He spoke with pride.
I persisted. It was what God wanted.
Dan and Mike listened as Young recounted the first time the Italian police showed up while he was preaching to those who had lost their path.
I was arrested. Me, not the Scarlet Women.
He was incredulous. He described how his superiors picked him up. Reverend Waters led their mission in Rome. He asked Young to stop his activities.
Waters said to me, "This work, as important as it was, is not why we are in Rome." He reminded me that Italy was a Catholic country. After the third time the Rome police arrested me, Reverend Waters sent me back to the States. I restarted my work, now with the Lost Women of Augusta. The church was not happy about that either. They arranged counseling for me, but it wasn't needed. I was doing God's work.
The conviction in William Young was unwavering. His church's unhappiness with his preaching to the women of Augusta drew a harsh response.
2 years ago, they asked me to resign from the church.
His smile never faltered.
It's better this way. Now, I answer only to God. I've been in Los Angeles 10 months now.
William Young ended his tale, confident the truth would set him free. Throughout the interview, Dan was torn between sympathy for the troubled man sitting across the table and the need to get more answers. As Young fell silent, Dan exchanged a look with Mike. They both knew that while Young saw himself as a man on a divine mission, 5 murdered women needed more from him. Dan and Mike stepped out into the hallway, closing the door behind them. The overhead lights were so bright, they made Mike squint.
What do you think?
Yeah, probably not our killer.
He was both relieved and frustrated. Turns out, it's not just war that will make you crazy, he thought grimly. Crazy comes in all shapes and sizes. He had hoped Young would be the one, just to bring this nightmare to a close. His partner concurred, tension visibly draining from his face.
Yeah, doesn't look like our killer, but he was in the vicinity.
But he was in the vicinity of all 5 killings.
Dan finished, voicing the thought they both shared.
We need to press him.
Agreeing, Mike's face took on a determined look.
I'll get on the phone and verify Young's story.
Despite the size of the challenge, Mike couldn't help but crack a smile.
I will find, and I will talk to the Presbyterian Church.
With a nod, Mike was off, and Dan made his way back into the interview room. The door closed behind him with a soft click. As he settled into the chair across from William Young, the man's eyes met his with defiance and expectation, as if daring Dan to challenge his convictions. Dan took a deep breath.
Mr. Young, how do you find these women who need saving?
Young's expression hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. The half-light of the interrogation room cast deep shadows across his face. The earnest preacher told him that sin was everywhere in the city. His words took on a zealous edge that made Dan's skin prickle. Bible Bill described Los Angeles as a modern-day Sodom and Gomorrah, rife with depravity and moral decay. He declared the women are lost souls, wandering in darkness and a blight upon God's creation.
I get your mission, Mr. Young. I do.
Choosing his words.
But what I need to know is how you discovered where these women operate. Can you walk me through that?
Young's eyes lit up as if grateful for the opportunity to expound on his methods.
Of course, Detective. You see, I spent weeks, months, really walking all over Los Angeles. This city, it's vast and full of hidden corners where sin festers like an open wound. I found myself drawn to three main areas. First, there's the stretch along Sunset Boulevard. The lights there, they're like beacons calling out to lost souls. Then there's downtown, especially around Skid Row and the edges of Little Tokyo. The desperation there, it's palpable.
Dan listened carefully. Young's understanding of the city's underbelly was comprehensive.
The third area is down by the harbor in San Pedro.
Young went on.
The docks, you see, they're a magnet for all sorts of unsavory activities. There are other places as well.
Young's eyes refocused on Dan as he concluded.
When I came upon a corner, vacant lot, or alleyway where the women gathered, I wrote it down. After a while, I had a map in my head, Detective. Every street, every dark alley where these poor souls congregate. It's all up here.
He tapped his temple, proud of what was inside. While the man's approach was bound to return little, his knowledge of the city's darker side was undeniably thorough. Dan made a show of jotting down notes as Young spoke, though his mind was already on his next line of questioning.
Mr. Young, when you were in Rome, did you hear about a prostitute who was murdered?
Young thought and shook his head.
I can't say that I did.
He replied. Dan moved closer, his eyes never leaving Young's face.
And her name was Maria Albano.
He watched for any sign that William knew her name.
She was murdered in her apartment, hacked to death by a sword, and her body was mutilated.
William Young was appalled to hear about Maria Albano's death. He had difficulty speaking. His hands trembled. He declared that women like Maria need help, not punishment, and that vengeance is for God alone. Despite Young's fervent tone and earnest expression, something nagged at Dan's instincts, a small voice whispering caution. He had seen too many bad guys wearing masks of sincerity to take anything at face value. He hoped what he said next would wring the complete truth from Bible Bill.
And now, Mr. Young, I need to tell you about a series of murders that have occurred here in Los Angeles.
Dan watched for any awareness or guilt in Young's eyes.
There have been 4 victims. Annie Carson, Susie Duke, Candy Floss, and Nancy Sanchez. All were prostitutes.
As Dan listed off the names, Young's expression remained blank, devoid of any hint of recognition. The street preacher shook his head.
That is dreadful. But I don't need to know their names to save them. God knows who they are, and that's what matters.
Dan persisted, his tone grave.
These 4 women were murdered, just like Maria Albano in Rome. They were brutally killed and then mutilated.
Young's face contorted with genuine shock and revulsion. His eyes widened and his mouth fell open. Dan could see the man's fingers curling into tight fists as if trying to ward off the horrific images the detective's words had conjured. Before Dan could continue, Young launched into an impassioned rant, his voice rising with each word. He said it was an abomination. Even though these women had strayed from God's path, they were still his children. They deserved compassion. Dan held up a hand, cutting off Young mid-sentence.
Mr. Young. Mr. Young, we believe it's the same killer.
He said directly, looking for a reaction.
Someone who was in Rome in 1946 and is here now in Los Angeles.
For a moment, Young seemed too overwhelmed by the knowledge of the murders to fully grasp what Dan was saying and its meaning. His eyes were distant, his lips moving as if in prayer. Then, slowly, realization dawned on his face, and he looked stunned.
Me?
Young gasped.
You think I could do something like that?
The hurt and outrage were real. As the entirety of the accusation settled upon him, Young's composure crumbled, his face twisted with anger, pain, and disbelief.
How dare you? I am a man of God. I seek to save these women, not harm them. To even suggest such a thing is...
Words failed him. Overcome with emotion, the street preacher began to cry. His body shook as he buried his face in his hands. Later, outside the interview room, Dan leaned against the wall in the hallway. He was relieved Young did not appear to be the killer, and he was bone-tired. Mike stood beside him, flipping through a notebook filled with hastily scribbled text.
You know, I don't think he's our guy. Young's probably crazy, but I don't see him as a killer. Certainly not one capable of the brutality we've seen.
Mike had reached the same conclusion.
I think you're right. After about 5 calls, I got through to Reverend Waters. He was Young's superior in Rome, and he confirmed Young's story. Every detail checks out.
What else did Waters have to say? Mike had been surprised by Waters' reaction.
Actually, yeah. He seemed genuinely concerned about Young. Said the church handled his case poorly.
Mike read from his notes, quoting Reverend Walters.
We are here to help. Unfortunately, sometimes the ones who need help the most are right under our noses.
So, where do we go from here?
Dan said, thinking out loud. A young woman walked up to Dan and Mike. She was modestly dressed, her demeanor tentative as she drew near. Her eyes darted between the two men, uncertain. She turned to Dan.
Are you Kelly? How is Bill? William Young? I paid for the yellow dress. Can he go?
Dan responded, curious.
Mr. Young did not mention a girlfriend.
In response, the woman stopped short. Her lips curved into a tiny smile, and she shook her head.
I'm not his girlfriend.
Apparently, it was a private joke Dan and Mike were not privy to. The woman, who introduced herself as Karen Potter, hesitated before elaborating.
He's just somebody I know.
Her eyes were downcast. Then, after a short pause, she said, in a tone that suggested she did not believe it herself.
I talked to Bill once, for about 5 minutes, a few days ago.
Dan parked his curiosity and explained that William Young would need a psychiatric examination. With a reassuring smile, he said,
But he does need a friend.
Karen's face brightened at this. As Dan reached for the doorknob to the interview room, a uniformed officer approached, his face lighting up as he spotted Karen.
Hey, Trixie. Almost didn't recognize you. How's Trix?
He was teasing and flirtatious. The woman sighed. She was found out. Karen had hoped she could get through this without seeing anyone she knew.
Hi, Casper. Just fine.
She rolled her eyes before disappearing into the interview room. Dan and Mike wondered what this was all about. Casper, seeing their puzzled looks, offered a terse explanation.
It was the blonde wig. Totally different.
He started to leave, but the detective's questioning looks stopped him in his tracks. Realizing his explanation had fallen short, Casper turned back to face Dan and Mike. Instead of speaking, he resorted to a series of odd gestures. First, he ran his hands down the sides of an imaginary figure, emphasizing the dramatic curves of a woman's body. Then, with a silent "wow" and a knowing smile, he cupped his fingers as if holding a pair of large melons. Dan struggled to match this description with the mild young woman they had just met.
You're talking about her.
Casper nodded enthusiastically. As Casper sauntered away, Dan and Mike looked at each other. They were both thinking about the troubled street preacher and Trixie. Dan remembered a joke he had made a few days ago.
There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
A few minutes later, Dan and Mike gathered their belongings, ready to call it a day. As he stuffed Air Force personnel files into a large envelope, Dan took stock. Young had been their most promising lead, and now they were back to square one. As they walked out of City Hall together, neither Dan or Mike could have known their breakthrough would come in a most unlikely place, on a beach. Chapter 37. As they drove toward Redstone, Dan and Mike sat in silence, their minds preoccupied with the case. The coastal road wound its way through the picturesque seaside town of Laguna Beach. The quaint charm of the area was evident in every detail. Modest cottages dotted the landscape, their weathered wood exteriors painted in soft pastels. Palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze, and colorful umbrellas peppered the golden shoreline. The latest automobiles cruised along the streets, their fat fenders, bright colors, and bold chrome accents dazzling in the sun. The town exuded a relaxed atmosphere. Then, Dan's voice broke through the quiet.
Pull over, Mike.
Mike obliged, guiding the car to a stop on the side of the road next to the beach. Before Mike understood what was happening, Dan opened the passenger door and took off his shoes and socks. He tossed his suit jacket onto the seat, loosened his tie, and rolled up his pant legs. He offered Mike a broad grin. In a flash, Dan was walking across the sand, leaving a bewildered Mike behind. Dan wiggled his toes in the warm sand.
Oh, that feels good.
He called back to Mike. "Come on!" Mike sat frozen in the driver's seat, his military training and ingrained sense of decorum warring with the urge to join his friend. As Dan walked farther away, Mike's internal struggle continued. Finally, he made his decision. He removed his cap and placed it atop his jacket in the car, then stepped out onto the sun-baked pavement. After just a few steps in the sand, Mike stopped and looked at his shoes. Barefoot was the point of whatever this was. Mike removed his shoes, tucking his socks inside, then carried them across the beach. The sensation of sand between his toes was a treat, and he admitted, if only to himself, that it did indeed feel good. He quickened his pace to catch up with Dan, who had already reached the water's edge. The two men stood side by side, allowing the gentle waves to lap at their feet. Dan glanced over at Mike, his eyes twinkling with amusement as he took in his partner's appearance. Mike's tie remained tightly knotted, a reminder of his rigid adherence to protocol. Mike caught Dan's gaze and shrugged, grinning sheepishly.
I can't.
He said, laughing at himself and the absurdity of the situation. Dan closed his eyes and tilted his face toward the sun, feeling its rays caress his skin.
Been a while since I've walked on a beach,
he mused in a wistful tone. Suddenly, A smile spread across his face as a pleasant memory surfaced.
You know, Mike,
His eyes still closed, savoring the warmth on his face and the sound of crashing waves.
there was a day, about 20 years ago, on this very spot. There was this girl, Melinda. No, Mindy. Her swimsuit followed every curve. It was something else.
Dan's mind went back to that summer day, recalling the scent of coconut oil and the feel of hot sand between his toes. He could almost hear Mindy giggling across the years, a sweet reminder of his youth.
For me, it was Jane.
Mike offered, surprising himself with his willingness to share.
Coney Island. Her suit was emerald green. She was sensational.
He paused, remembering.
Coney Island was jam-packed, and every guy's eyes were on Jane.
Dan cracked open an eye, looking at Mike with curiosity.
Jammed.
Like an anthill.
So, no place to neck.
Dan asked with mischievous intent. Mike, who had also lifted his face to the sun, eyes closed, let out a short laugh,
Not a chance.
shaking his head slightly. As they stood there, feet in the cool water and faces warmed by the sun, Mike found himself appreciating this spontaneous moment. While initially confused by Dan's unexpected action, he now had to admit it was exactly what they needed. The case, their mission, seemed far away for now, replaced by memories of simpler times. Dan looked out at the horizon, his eyes following the gentle rolling of the waves. His thoughts drifted back to their recent encounter.
Poor Bible Bill.
He said, breaking the silence that had settled between them.
He's created his own world and made himself the White Knight, riding in on a horse to save it. It's a shame, really.
Mike's expression mirrored the concern on Dan's face.
Yeah, it is. You know, the world's full of people who fall through the cracks. Guys like Bible Bill, they're everywhere if you look hard enough. Sometimes I wonder how many we miss, how many slip by unnoticed until it's too late. In the Army, we get men with problems. Putting a uniform on them and teaching them how to drill doesn't make the problems go away. We've been entirely focused on the military. Dr. French reminded me of something. But not all Americans in Rome after the war were with the forces.
Dan nodded in agreement.
True enough, but getting information about non-military personnel has been like pulling teeth. Thacker's call to the State Department hasn't even produced a list of agencies that were operating in Rome.
Dan played with the sand under his feet.
Think about all those calls we handled involving Americans. How many weren't servicemen? And what were they about?
Mike's brow furrowed as he searched his memory.
2 or 3 tops. There was a bar fight with the doctor from Cleveland.
He paused, thinking.
And a couple of drunken disorderlies. That's about it.
Exactly.
Dan said, watching a seagull dive toward the water.
We have to concentrate on the military for now. It's what we have.
Dan fell silent. Mike added,
And then there's Bible Bill.
The mention of Bible Bill brought them both back to the reality of their investigation, the peaceful moment on the beach beginning to fade. The waves continued their steady rhythm against their feet, but the carefree mood had shifted to something more serious.
Crazy comes in all shapes and sizes.
Dan's eyes suddenly snapped open as a thought broke through the peace of the beach. He turned to Mike.
The Los Angeles victims all had some kind of VD. I don't think there was anything about this in Maria Albano's file. But you said, when you talked to Hank Kowalski, He told you he saw Maria just before she was killed. Was it at a hospital?
Mike recalled his wild conversation with Hank.
Doctor's office.
He corrected.
He also thought Maria gave him VD, but the way he carried on,
An American doctor.
yes, I think so.
Dan, his mind racing, asked,
Do you remember the doctor's name?
Mike shook his head.
Don't think Hank said.
You need to call Hank.
Dan's expression left no room for argument. Without a word, Mike turned back toward the road, his eyes scanning for a phone booth. Spotting one in the distance, he took off across the beach, carrying his shoes and socks, his bare feet kicking up sand as he ran. Mike reached the phone booth, slightly winded, and stepped inside. He dropped his shoes and socks on the floor, fumbling in his pockets for coins. He picked up the receiver and dialed. Standing at the water's edge, Dan turned back to the ocean. He closed his eyes. The rhythmic sound of the surf and the heat of the sun began to work their magic, and his mind drifted. Something about this moment, perhaps the peaceful solitude or the hypnotic motion of the waves, was pulling him toward a memory he'd locked away, of a day that changed his life. Chapter 38. As Mike was making his call, Dan's attention was drawn to a girl on the beach, about Allie's age, playing a game of Catch Me If You Can with her boyfriend. They were laughing and cavorting in the sand as she artfully avoided his grasp. Breathlessly, she evaded him and then let out a shriek. He missed her by inches. Dan closed his eyes, turned his face to the sun, and remembered a similar scene 4 years before in Rome. On a hot, bright day, Dan sat in his Jeep, stuck motionless in a Roman traffic circle. His eyes were closed, the sun's warmth bringing life into his weary soul. The gentle hum of the idling engine and the chatter of the ancient city almost lulled him into a peaceful trance, until a sudden, shrill shriek pierced the air, causing his eyes to snap wide open and his head to whip around. Through the sea of pedestrians and vehicles, Dan's eyes locked onto a young girl, laughing as she skipped through the crowd. Her chestnut curls bounced with each step, and her cheeks flushed with the thrill of the chase. Close on her heels was a teenage boy, presumably her boyfriend, teasing as he pursued her. The girl's eyes sparkled with mischief as she found refuge behind a lamppost, using it as a barrier between herself and her pursuer. With a playful squeal and a giggle, she dodged his outstretched hands, her slight form twisting and turning like a prancing pony. Dan watched the couple's playful antics with amusement and envy. Their carefree laughter and joy were in opposition to what was on his mind: the murder of Maria Albano. As the girl danced around the lamppost, her hair shimmered with each graceful movement. Dan was captivated. The reactions from the surrounding pedestrians varied. Some onlookers smiled indulgently, charmed by the sight of youthful exuberance. Others wore frowns of disapproval and annoyance at the disruption. Dan observed the different responses with detached curiosity, his own emotions a tangled web of nostalgia and longing for home. As the couple's game of chase continued, traffic began to move again. His foot pushed down on the accelerator, and he merged back into the flow of cars, trucks, buses, and bicycles. But then, as the sight and sound of the young couple faded, another noise assaulted Dan's senses. It came from nowhere. The screams that had haunted his nights for weeks. Marie Albano's desperate cries for help ran through his mind, each agonizing moan a cruel reminder of the atrocities he had witnessed. Images of her death struggle flooded his mind, the vivid details now ingrained. Dan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against his taut skin. The sound of his own ragged breathing mixed with the phantom screams that seemed to envelop him. Realizing the futility of his attempts to outrun the demons that plagued him, Dan pulled the Jeep over to the side of the street. As the engine died, Dan shut his eyes, willing himself to regain control. He inhaled deeply, the air filling his lungs. When he finally released the steering wheel, his hands were shaking, a physical manifestation of the turmoil that raged within him. The war had left its indelible mark, and no matter how hard he tried, Dan knew that the scars it had left on his soul would never fully heal. Dan's eyes popped open, drawn to the spire of a Catholic church down the block. The sight of the ancient edifice stirred something deep within him, a longing for solace and respite. With a shaky breath, he climbed out of the Jeep, his boots making hard contact with the street. As he made his way toward the church, the noise of the city faded, replaced by a cacophony of haunting echoes. Rapid-fire bursts of machine guns were punctuated by the screams of men caught in the throes of battle. Dan's steps faltered, his body tensing as the sights and sounds of Monte Cassino would not be denied. The air seemed to grow thick and oppressive, the scent of smoke and blood assailing his nostrils. Dan's breath came in jagged gasps, his chest constricting as if trapped in the vice-like grip of an unseen force. The sounds of conflict swirled around him, each anguished cry a blow to Dan's self-control. Despite the onslaught from his past, Dan moved ahead, his feet carrying him to the church. Dan pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the church. The cool air hit his face, leaving the heat of the Roman day behind. The smell of incense and candle wax pulled him forward as he moved through the dimly lit church. His footsteps on the marble floor reverberated through the space. With trembling fingers, he dipped into the holy water font and crossed himself. The ancient ritual did little to quell the noise in his head. Walking down the center aisle, the grandeur of the church's interior revealed itself. The pews, worn smooth by generations of faithful, stood in silent rows, offering the promise of rest. Dan was drawn to the altar, its gilded surface aglow in flickering candlelight. Reaching the front, Dan paused, his body moving through the motions of reverence learned in childhood. He genuflected. The sign of the cross followed, his fingers tracing the path from forehead to chest, shoulder to shoulder. With a heavy breath, he eased himself onto the nearest pew, causing the timber to groan as it had done for decades. Dan brought his hands together, partly in prayer and partly to suppress the tremors that coursed through his body. He lowered himself to his knees, the hard surface of the kneeler a welcome relief as he sought to ground himself in this place. But as he closed his eyes, intending to find peace in prayer, the sounds of war rushed back with brutal intensity. The noise of combat replaced the quiet of the church. An explosion rocked his senses, followed by the frantic yells of men caught in the chaos of battle.
Incoming! Hit the deck!
Gunfire crackled in his ears, each shot a visceral reminder of the violence he had been part of. A soldier's hysterical scream broke through the roar.
Hurry! The radio's out! I can't get anyone!
Dan's hands, still clasped together, tightened until his knuckles shook with the strain. His eyes clenched shut as if he could physically block out the memories that assaulted him. But the barrage continued, dragging him deeper into the hell that was Monte Cassino. The sights, sounds, and smells of that fateful battle overpowered his senses. Each explosion and scream of pain more vivid than the last. His body began to shake, a physical sign of the turmoil raging within his mind. Dan's lips moved in silent prayer, desperately seeking an escape from the spiral of fear and anguish that threatened to take him. The line between past and present blurred, leaving him trapped in a nightmarish loop. Just as the weight of his trauma threatened to crush him entirely, a gentle touch on his shoulder startled Dan back to reality. The sudden contact pulled him out of his combat-induced trance, his eyes flying open as he whirled to face the source of the interruption. His eyes traveled upward, meeting the kindly smile of a rather large priest with blonde hair. Dan's features relaxed slightly at the sight of the man's soft smile. The priest's voice, deep and soothing, seemed to cut through the din of war that echoed in Dan's mind.
Can I buy you a cup of coffee?
Dan hesitated. But there was something in the priest's open expression, a sense of understanding and compassion that beckoned to Dan. His presence seemed to chase the ugliness away. Unlocking his fingers, Dan reached out and grasped the priest's arm, using the physical contact as an anchor to the present moment. With a slight nod, he cleared his throat, his voice raspy and strained.
Yes. That would be good.
Grateful for the offer. The priest's large hands enveloped Dan's in a firm, reassuring grip as he introduced himself.
My name is Thaddeus, but you can call me Ted.
Dan! Dan!
Mike shouted. Dan's return to Rome had only lasted a few minutes. His eyes snapped open to find Mike running excitedly toward him. As Mike drew closer, Dan could see the sparkle in his eyes, a clear sign that he had uncovered something significant.
Hank said the doctor's name was Moss.
Mike blurted out, his words tumbling forth in a breathless rush.
Dr. Moss was the name on the penicillin bottle in Nancy Sanchez's medicine cabinet.
Mike's words electrified Dan, sending a charge through his body. His mind raced. Fired up, Dan spoke.
You call Hank back. Tell him to get to LAPD headquarters. Then we'll call Thacker.
Dan's eyes locked with Mike's, conveying the importance of the moment. They were closing in on something big, and time was of the essence. With a curt nod, Mike pivoted on his heel and hurried back across the sand to the phone booth. Dan turned back toward the vast expanse of the ocean. The rhythmic wash of water kissed his toes,